Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever wanted to realize a big, bright future, no matter what the situation is right now, then do we have the Ideal Realized Neville Goddard for the New Year show for you. Today I'll be talking with Mitch Horowitz, award-winning pen historian, about his latest work, a compilation of the top tips and techniques of a law of attraction master, Neville Goddard, The Ideal Realized. And that's just what I want to talk with him about rewiring your subconscious, sculpting a new you, and practical exercises from Neville Goddard. That, plus we'll talk about why today feels like Sunday, 2 tickets in Ada, the power of remember when, and what in the world rebels and making money has to do with anything. So welcome back to the show, Mitch. Are you ready to shine?
Yes, great to be here, Michael.
Well, great to have you here and a mighty woohoo! So, before we dive right into things, I must embarrass you, Mitch. After reading this book, my first thought was, Neville is the true master of new thought. And then my next thought was, Mitch is the true master. I am so impressed with this book, with your ability to disseminate Neville, for your ability to share this on a level we can all understand and give us tools to work with.
Thank you. I appreciate that enormously. I've been reading Neville, involved in Neville's work, since probably 2005, and even maybe going back a year before that. And not only has Neville's work been deeply meaningful to me in terms of the trajectory of my own life, but it was really Neville and writing about Neville where I got the earliest and first impression that I could be a writer. And one of the things I always like to point out to people, and I feel it's very important, I never tire of saying this. I didn't publish my first book, Occult America, until I was past the age of 40. I must have been about 43, something like that. I just recently celebrated my 55th birthday, which was in November. And I just always want people to be aware that I had left behind writing for many, many, many years. I did not return to writing until I was deep into my 30s. I was probably around age 36 or something like that. And I wrote a profile of Neville Goddard called Evidence of Things Hoped For. And it became the introduction to a Neville reader. And it was originally published in Science of Mind magazine. It must have been in early 2005. And it just gave me the sensibility that what you do on a micro scale, you can do on a macro scale. You can always repeat on a macro scale what you've done on a more intimate one. And writing that small profile, that historical profile of Neville, gave me proof positive that I could continue to do that on a larger scale. And it was about a year or two later that I started working in earnest on my book, Occult America, which came out in 2009. So Neville opened every door for me.
Awesome. And let's go there. I want to hear a little bit more about who Neville is for people. But before we do that, you said evidence of things hoped for. And so what I'm curious about is Neville says, mind is God. What does that mean? And do our thoughts really, truly create our reality?
Neville's central teaching, as you just alluded, is that your imagination is God, and that in Scripture, whenever you come across reference to Christ or God, it is a symbolic reference to the human imagination, and that every individual is the manifestation, is the flesh-clothed essence of the Creator, and is creating every experience, every relationship, every encounter, everything that's concrete in your world, you're creating all the time through your own imagination in Neville's teaching. And in fact, if one follows the logic of Neville's teaching, it's plain enough to say, I address this to you, Michael, I address this to the Inspire Nation viewers. There's no Mitch here. I'm a figment of you. I'm a projection of you. You're hearing my voice. You're hearing this particular teaching simply because you were for whatever reason, at this time, psychically or intellectually prepared to hear it, to receive it. But I just happen to be the vehicle through which it's reaching you. I'm not here. There's Michael. There's whomever is watching. Susan, Audrey, Robert, whomever within the Inspire Nation family is watching. It's just them, that person, that individual whose imagination is pushing out this conversation right now.
Isn't it cool? And it's not really where I want to dovetail, but it is really cool when you think about it on a quantum or quanta level. Waves collapsing into particle is actually what you're talking about here on a very real level, is that imagination, our presence, where we put that laser beam of light, or he calls it a beam of light, where we put that light is what we come up with. So what's fascinating to me about Neville is that he looks at the Bible symbolically. Well, many things are fascinating. He looks at the Bible symbolically, and he looks at all the stories of symbolically, and he says, well, the Bible says the kingdom of God is within. What did he mean by that?
Neville meant literally that there's a force of creation in the universe. Neville referred to it as God because he was scripturally oriented. The ancient Greeks and Egyptians might have referred to it as nous, or higher mind. You have different languages and terminology. Ralph Waldo Emerson called it the oversoul. Napoleon Hill called it infinite intelligence. Call it what you will. There is this creative force, and Neville's teaching is that this creative force divided itself into each of these individuals so that it could have experiences, and that our aim as human beings, as clothed outposts, expressions, figments of this force, is that we come to know ourselves as creative beings. We've fallen asleep to that aspect of our nature and ultimately rejoin with who we really are. We are that which creates, that which is called God in Scripture. And the purpose of human life is to come into that knowingness of yourself.
Thank you. And it strikes me, if we go down this road of mind as God, as imagination as creator, it strikes me people are going, well, where's my $1 million? Why are we still in COVID? All of these things.
Right, of course.
But there's an element here. If we're going to go scripturally, let's play with the scripture for a little minute. Our Father or Holy Father, there is an element of the subconscious within that Neville does a better job dealing with, up until this book maybe, than anybody else at saying we have to deal with both sides of the equation or we get nowhere.
Well, Neville was, as you were alluding earlier, I think the greatest mystical analog ever to quantum physics, quantum theory. And when Neville was alive, he died in 1972. And when he really came into his own as a teacher and thinker and speaker, which was late 1930s, early 1940s, quantum theory as we know it today was not popularized. There were not many ways for the layperson to talk about quantum theory. But if you read what Neville wrote, say, throughout the 1940s, a period where quantum theory was not known to a public audience, the confluence, the correspondence is just incredible. Neville would say things to the effect of, we live in a serial universe, and scientists will one day explain to us why we live in this serial universe, but our concern right now is how to use it. He made that statement, I believe, in 1948. And so Neville was providing a mystical analog to quantum theory at a time when quantum theory wasn't really available to the layperson. So there's that extraordinary aspect of his career. And the other aspect, to which I think you're alluding, is the sheer radical nature of Neville's teaching. Neville's teaching is the most radical iteration of New Thought philosophy. It's not the same as Napoleon Hill. It's not the same as some of the financial motivational figures that we know and love and have talked about on this show. It's different. It's really different. Neville's program, and it's going to sound a little strange saying this in the 21st century, especially since you and I have talked about programs that do not work this way. But Neville's program is not a program of outer action. Neville really taught and believed that everything occurs within. Yes, you and I, the individual, have to function within the world as we find it. If we walk into a room, unless perhaps we're in an extremely developed state, we need to flick on a light switch. Or if you want to buy a ticket to something, you are going to have to go through whatever the mechanics are to purchase that ticket. So there was an allowance for the fact that you have to function within the world of Caesar, as Neville would put it. But he insisted that world is simply your imagination outpictured, your psychical images, emotionalized thoughts pushed out and concretized. And Neville would say an assumption, though false, if persisted in, will eventually harden into fact. I cannot emphasize how literally the man meant that. This was a teacher of absolute mysticism, by which I mean that there was no materialism in Neville's point of view. By materialism, I mean the notion that matter exists, that matter creates itself. Everything that we experience, Neville taught, is born of the imagination. Outer action is not required in his system, in his teaching.
And it's fascinating because I think both you and I agree that there is a two-step dance element, or as the expression goes, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. You still need to. And Neville's saying, if you put that laser beam focus, again, my terms, he wouldn't say laser beam, but he would say beam of light, that laser beam focus on something, that in a sense, you may have to go to the ticket counter. But the tickets, and I am making an allusion here, the tickets will come to you.
That's right. And again, Neville would tell story after story, sometimes from his own life, sometimes from the lives of students, where this would occur. And for example, one of the lectures that I reproduce in this book, I believe is titled Even the Wicked. And I use that title because Neville makes the point in the lecture that even the wicked play their part in whatever this cosmic unfoldment, this cosmic drama is that is born of your imagination. So Neville tells a story where he was originally from the West Indies. Neville was born on the island of Barbados in 1905, came to the United States, came to New York City, where I currently am, to study theater at age 17. And if I may, as an aside, it was a different era. I mean, here's this kid from the West Indies who gets on a steamer and comes to New York City to become a drama student at age 17. I would venture that some of your listeners who are old enough to have kids are trying to figure out how to get them out of the basement, maybe past a certain age. And, here's a very, very young person coming from a tropical environment to an urban environment. And you can imagine how challenging that must have been and how brave that really was. And you'll forgive the digression, but when Neville first came to the United States, he spoke with a British Barbadian accent. And when you listen to lectures of Neville, and there are many online, you're very often hearing him, not always, but often, towards the end of his life. You're hearing lectures that were recorded in the late 60s. Neville, as a very, very young person, might have had less of what we would consider a refined accent. It might have been a more rural, more rounded accent with more of an island patois to it. And Neville told a story that when he first began his drama classes, a teacher, a very cruel teacher, called him up to the front of the room and said, "Now this is a man who will never make a living using his voice," because she didn't like this rounded island accent that he had. Very cruel. And Neville said,
let me just interject. And awesome. Because if mind is creator and all of these things are taking place created by the mind, that was actually setting him on a certain trajectory.
Exactly. And he said, she attempted to make me the class goat. That was the expression he used, an old-fashioned expression. She attempted to make me the class goat, but she didn't know what kind of man she was dealing with. And I swore at that moment that I would one day make a living using my voice, which of course he did. Which is why I always tell people, friction is a goad to development. Friction is a goad to the fulfillment of the necessary. Without friction, we would just be kept. You and I have talked about this before. We'd be kept poodles, or we'd be like pretty fish in an aquarium somewhere. We need friction. Mm-hmm. That was Neville's experience of friction. But my reason for this digression was to share just a brief story that much later in life, two of his brothers from the West Indies came to visit him in New York City. Yeah. And they were here for a couple of weeks, and they wanted to see every Broadway show, every opera. They wanted to see everything. And there was a wonderful production of Aida at the Metropolitan Opera House. And it had been sold out for weeks. And Neville said, everywhere in town there was a poster for Aida. Somebody had wheat pasted over it, sold out. And you were told, do not come to the box office. Do not ask for tickets to Aida. We have nothing. And so nonetheless, Neville's two brothers, they wanted to see Aida. And he said, I had no idea how this was going to occur, but I held a mental picture of my brothers seeing Aida. And so Neville said he went to the box office. And as he was online at the box office, there was a man in front of him who engaged in some sort of scheme where he ripped off the teller at the box office. He might have slipped the teller, instead of slipping the teller a 20, he slipped him a 5, and the teller gave him back change for a 20, and the teller would have been responsible for making up the difference from his cash drawer. And Neville noticed what was going on. And he said, as this man began to leave the line, Neville said, I turned around to him and I said, sir, come back here. And Neville could speak, now in this very imposing mid-Atlantic accent. He's no longer the rural youth from the West Indies, very imposing man. And so the man came back, and Neville exposed what he had done, and he saved the teller from having been responsible for making up the difference in his cash drawer. And the teller was so grateful. He said to him, sir, whatever I can do for you. And he said, what you can do is provide me with 2 tickets to Aida. And the guy provided him with the 2 tickets. And Neville said, now, every theater, every opera house always has extra tickets, because if some VIP shows up, they want to be able to give that person tickets so they can see the show. And Neville said, I am no VIP, but I simply understand the uses of imagination. And his point was, this man who was a thief, who was online in front of him, facilitated Neville's ability to get the tickets. So he said, unfoldment will always occur in some way that you could never foresee. There's never a way that any of us can know precisely how our mental pictures will come into focus. That's beyond knowing. That's beyond knowing. But that it will come into focus is assured. And in this case, I called the lecture Even the Wicked, because Neville made the point that even the wicked, even the thief in this case, he had his part to play. He had his part to play. So, of course, this is just a personal, intimate example, but that's how Neville saw life, that everything and everyone that you encounter is purposeful and is, in fact, you.
If there's one tool I would recommend to learn how to drop in and hear from consciousness, hear from source, hear from the universe, it would be automatic writing, because you're going to get guidance. You're speaking with the universe, you're asking questions, and you're getting answers. You're going quiet, you're putting your pen to paper, and the answers begin to flow. So this program is over 40 videos, over 8 modules that walks you through step by step. How do you get out of the mind? How do you drop into this process? Plus, we get together once a month on Zoom and help you improve your skills. So if there was one tool where you could literally put your pen to paper and say, where do I go from here? And all of a sudden your finger starts moving and you start getting answers, that's automatic writing. This fits in perfectly with the ticket, because he didn't believe there were no tickets left, and he didn't put his attention on it. He says, to dissolve a problem that now seems so real to you, all that you do is remove your attention from it.
Yes, yes. And this can be very challenging, because on one hand, it's very simple, right? Where your attention goes, there goes your experience in the most literal sense.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, our psyches sometimes are entrained, conditioned to dwell upon problems. In fact, if we're frank with ourselves, we sometimes enjoy dwelling upon these problems. We
Dopamine.
run grudges through our heads again and again. We have revenge fantasies. I mean, this is, we have to speak plainly about human nature. And so we're not always of a state of mind where we want to withdraw from the unlovely and focus on the lovely. And in fact, one of the things that I'm wrestling with right now, you and I are speaking in December of 2020. We're going into a new year. It's a very reflective time for me. One of the issues that I am personally wrestling with in New Thought in general is that it could be that some of us very legitimately have different personality types that are not always given to a tendency towards what is considered loving and sweet and confectionery. And so if an individual, and I don't know that all of our personalities as expressed ultimately converge into this kind of numinous wholeness. It may be that while allowing for the fact that mind is ultimate, we have different psyches and personas that are entirely legitimate expressions of the ultimate. And, I don't necessarily act the same way that you do. You don't necessarily act the same way that your neighbor Ralph does. Your neighbor Ralph doesn't necessarily act the same way that his friend Carol does. And I mean this very seriously. People have radically different personalities, are possessed of radically different impulses, wishes, points of view, all of which, while they may stem from the ultimate, are not necessarily or even desirably dissolvable into one personality type. And I think some of the difficulties that we may face in applying Neville's methods and in applying New Thought methods, and this is just something I began to think about today, so it's very new, and I'm sharing it for the first time with you and the Inspire Nation family. There is a certain kind of personality that is emergent, say, from the Beatitudes or from an idealized Judeo-Christian tradition in the West. And I speak in those terms only because that's where we happen to live. If we were living somewhere else, we would have different dominant cultural religious traditions. There are, of course, lots of religious and cultural traditions in the United States where we happen to be right now, but the dominant ideal is just because of the passage of time and the nature of geography, is the Judeo-Christian outlook of beneficence that's probably best expressed in the Beatitudes. I honor that, but that's not necessarily the expression, experience, or only legitimate way of being of every individual. And so if that's not your expression, experience, and if that's not defining of your psyche, it's not always easy to follow the personality prescriptions as they exist in Neville and New Thought. That's just something I'm thinking about, because I think there are many very legitimate ways and ethical ways of human expressiveness.
Neville would say, send them to love, wouldn't he?
Neville would say, dwell upon that which is lovely, assume the best for another, engage in praise, engage in loveliness. I personally respond better, just speaking for myself, when Neville speaks in language of nobility and honor and valor. And he speaks in that language as well. It's easier for me to get down with that language. And Neville often said that if if we were as focused on that which is noble within us as we are focused on that which is petty or grasping within us, our lives would transform radically and with just extraordinary speed and velocity if we demonstrated the same passion for that which is noble within us as we do for that which is petty. I take that very seriously.
Thank you. Let's dive in there as we talk about the subconscious. And I believe he talks about the conflict, I may have the wording wrong, between will and imagination. We'll call it between the petty and the noble. The noble, well, it's interesting. We have a subconscious, and he has written so brilliantly on the subconscious, of which it kind and gently won't allow the conscious mind in.
Yes. You know, this division that you've referenced between will and imagination is extremely important. And one of the things I write about in The Ideal Realized is that this is one of the very few instances. Neville was such an original thinker. He sounded like no one. But in this particular case, he took inspiration for that idea very directly from the French mind theorist Émile Coué, who I am a big, big admirer of. Émile Coué was active mostly in the 19-teens, 1920s. He died in 1926, and he was famous for the affirmation day by day in every way, I am getting better and better. And one of the things I demonstrate in The Ideal Realized is that Neville uses language to talk about will versus imagination that's very, very close in nature to Coué's own language. And I was excited when I discovered this because Émile Coué and Neville Goddard are literally two of my favorite thinkers. They're probably the people I most often quote. Mm-hmm. And so to detect a connection between them was personally very exciting for me. Neville's teaching on will and imagination is exactly the same as Émile Coué's teaching, and it is this. Coué taught that imagination is more powerful than will, that what we call willpower doesn't stand up at all to the overwhelming impact of imagination. And he used as an example the following. If somebody laid a plank across a floor and said, I'd like you to walk across this plank, you could walk across it with no problem. If they took the same plank and they elevated it 20 feet into the air and said, now walk across the plank, although the physical act is exactly the same, you would imagine the possibility of falling. That would fill you with fear. That would fill you with nervousness. That would produce physical changes in you. The nervousness in and of itself increases the likelihood of one falling. So that's what Coué was driving at. That's what Neville was also driving at when he said will and imagination pitted against each other will always emerge with the imagination being more powerful. How you conceive of yourself, your sense of maturity, self-responsibility, personal aptitude. These things are they're matters of conditioning. They're matters of self-perception. We all have greater or lesser strengths, weaknesses in different areas, but very often our overall self-image is heavily conditioned, and it's based on autosuggestion, the things that we repeat to ourselves over and over since a very early age. There may be other factors as well, but that's a very, very powerful one. How you imagine yourself to be is more determinative of your experience than what you will yourself to be. So Coué believed from a more psychological point of view, as Neville believed from a more mystical point of view, that if you can gently recondition your sense of self, you will attain victory. If you push against that sense of self through willpower, you're engaged in a kind of a hopeless gambit because your imagination and your self-perception is more important than your will.
I love that you say gently recondition, because my mantra has been for many years now, kind, gentle, easy, good. Kind, gentle, easy, good. I'm not a stoic where I believe, and I used to, and pushing that stone uphill as hard as you can. Because to me, you're going to get pushback, and sooner or later, that stone is going to win. And I believe that's what both you and Neville are referencing here.
Yes. And I would say the following. Neville tells a lot of extraordinary stories in his books, all of which I absolutely believe because I've done the forensics on some of them, and I always found that Neville really told it like it was. Some of the stories that he told, I was able to peel the onion back on, and he tells a story about being given an honorable discharge from the army during World War II after 4 months, and a very strange set of circumstances. Anyway, I found Neville's military records, and such a discharge was given. And I found a number of cases where whatever went on, the logistics match up. So I take Neville's stories very seriously. Now, he talks about a lot of extraordinary stories where things will happen all of a sudden, getting tickets to a show, or a young woman who's blind, finding two men who volunteered to drive her to and from work because she was facing a situation of immobility, and the solution arrives, and arrives quickly, and arrives concretely. Personally speaking, and I want to share this with your listeners because I feel it's very important that people feel encouraged in using this material.
Yeah.
I don't always see the immediate effects, the immediate benefits, but I'm a person who probably has a lot of conflicting and crisscrossing ideas that runs through his psyche, like many people watching, I suspect. But I do see the changes. I do see the changes over the arc of my life. And as Neville got older, he would frequently talk about the issue of gestation. There has to be a gestation period for everything.
Yes.
So for human life, it's 9 months. For a horse, it's 11 months. For a goat, I don't know, 7 months. For a chick, 30 days. There's going to be some gestation period. And I just want people to feel that at liberty to allow for that.
Well, it's a topic I was bringing up with a coaching client earlier today. So I love it when these threads start continuing from one conversation to the next. Is that no matter, maybe not, but I'm going to say the better manifestors and better teachers, whatever that means, you don't necessarily get it right away. It's not that all of a sudden the elephant, the Tesla, the whatever falls out of the sky, but the lessons that are most beneficial to you come out of that initial impetus, and we start to recognize the conflicts and crisscrossing of ideas. In the beginning of this book, in fact, and I referenced at the start, you said that you're a rebel, and one of the challenges, or you're most closely not connected. There's a word.
Yeah.
And so we look at
the cultural figures I relate to best tend to be rebellious.
Yeah, so we don't think of Thoreau, for instance, as being the wealthiest guy on the planet. And so when you relate to him closely and you're saying, show me the money, there can be some inner blocks until they're discovered.
Yes, and I appreciate you bringing that up. I made that reference in the introduction. I do tend to identify with the outsider, the rebel, culturally, musically, whatever it may be. And I wondered if those identifications, and there's sort of hidden tendrils of connection, these things, these feelings that we have, they're very emotional. And they're matters of a deeply felt constitutional taste within the individual. We don't necessarily bring light to them, as you were just doing. We don't necessarily think about them, but they're there. They're there. And they construct the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And they're powerful precisely because they're not expository. They're not things that we're thinking about all day long. I don't walk around thinking, I like rebels. In fact, when you were doing your introductions to the show, honestly, the reference was lost on me. I didn't even realize. I was like, what's Michael driving at there?
I saw the gears going. I'm like, I didn't give him enough of a bone.
Right. And it's funny because you have such a mind for detail. Somebody will say something to you, somebody will make a reference, and you remember it better than the source, him or herself, actually did. And that's a wonderful aspect of your persona. So when you were saying that, I thought to myself, I know he's accurately capturing something, but I just don't know what it is. So you've reminded me of that. But the reason for my saying this is that we don't walk around applying definitions to our preferences. They're just there. They're just there. They're tastes. They're part of our constitutional makeup. And yet these things shape the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. So you've got somebody like me who gravitates towards the cultural rebel and who also wants money, as all of us do, most of us. Does that create a cross current in some way? And that's a question. That's a question that I have to carry with me. Does admiring Thoreau, who's famous for living in a single room log cabin for 2 years on the shores of a lake called Walden in Concord, Mass., does that idealization chafe against something else that I want in my life? And is that a problem or is that okay? And should that set me to reorienting or to rethinking things? Why do I like Thoreau so much? I like the simplicity of his life. I like the way that he was able to just get his hands around everything. I personally like to be surrounded by very simple, basic things. My tastes tend to be very, very simple. I own very few items of clothing, for example. I like that. But at the same time, I also have a taste for, I want to be able to do things for myself and others that require resources. So I have to bring some daylight to that story that I tell myself and see whether it's creating cross purposes or a delay of some kind.
Thank you. Let's dive into there. So I'm thinking of Neville coming over from the West Indies, and I'm thinking of the cross currents that must have been there. You mentioned the most basic, a geographical one, but also a cross current of a race, of a social upbringing, of an accent, of all of these pieces, which had to affect his psyche. How was he able to move past his own cross currents? And how can we use that to work past ours? Because everybody who's listening to this, who's saying, I want more money, every single one of us, I'm convinced, has a cross current that is saying, well, really the opposite.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Part of Neville's ability stemmed, I think, from his training as an actor. As I said, he came here to the United States at age 17 to study theater. He worked for many years successfully as an actor and a dancer. He toured America and Europe as part of a dance troupe. And Neville, as an actor, as a dancer, as someone who was very trained in the uses of his body and in the adoption of a mood, he had a great aptitude to adopt a feeling state, and that's the center of Neville's methodology. Adopt the feeling state. How would you feel were it so? I have a tattoo of Neville here on my arm, and it says, live from the end. And so the idea is you're supposed to try to capture the feeling state of the wish fulfilled and view life from the perspective of that feeling state. Now, one of the reasons I put together the Ideal Realized is because that may have been easier for Neville to do than it is for your average person. Neville was trained as an actor, and he was by nature a thespian. Entering into a feeling state is something that may have come very naturally for him. It might not come as naturally for me, although as it happens, I did study acting when I was a teenager. And I think method acting is a wonderful tool to possess if you are interested in the work of Neville or other New Thought figures. But method acting operates on the principle of creating some sort of internal association or some sort of inner monologue that gets you into the actual feeling state of the character. In the method acting approach, you want to be gazing at the world through the character's eyes. You're not just play acting, you are in that emotional state. If you don't have that training, I don't know that Neville's system is going to crack itself open as easily and as readily as he sometimes depicts it. But that's part of why I did this book, because I wanted to focus on a wide range of methods that Neville provided in the event that that feeling state entry wasn't as easy for everyone.
Thank you. And I had thespian training in my teens as well, which is interesting. I never made that association, although it's always to me about the feeling state. I want to spend the last third of this interview talking about different tools people can use. And my favorite came up, I believe it was just before the end in here. And I've heard, forgive me, I've had so many guests on, read so many books. There isn't that much that appears that radically new. And one that did appear from Neville is so incredibly simple, yet profound. Remember when.
Yes. Yes. Duncan Trussell put it beautifully. He said, Neville is teaching us to remember from the future. And Neville's method along those lines is that you are supposed to imagine yourself looking back upon a situation that has since changed, For example, if you're standing in an empty lot and you want this empty lot to hold a building that you've constructed, you would remember when it was an empty lot. So you're there in the scene, but you're regarding the scene as if you're remembering it. Remember when this was just an empty lot before I had that beautiful building there? Remember when I felt lonely and wanted companionship and wanted company, and now I'm with a significant other or surrounded by family or friends or whatever it may be. Remember when I wasn't able to afford to fly home for Christmas, and now I fly home several times a year, whatever it is. So you're able to use the sensory experience of your current surroundings, but you're regarding that sensory experience as a memory rather than as the thing itself. And that could be very powerful.
Remember when we had only gotten together a dozen times and we didn't have this new thought foundation between you and me that is helping to change the world.
Right.
What's the three-step miracle, Mitch?
Oh, well, the three-step miracle is a very simple method that I've adapted from a man named Roy Herbert Jarrett, who went by the initials of RHJ. He wrote a book called It Works, which came out in the early 1920s, actually contemporaneous to Emile Coué. He was also an admirer of Coué. And the prescription for the three-step miracle is very simply that you decide upon things that you really truly want in life, and you be in deep, earnest seriousness about it. You write these things down on a list, a very simple sheet of paper. You carry this list with you. You read it 3 times a day, morning, noon, and night. And step 3 is you simply give thanks when what you want reaches you. And you give silent thanks and you tell no one else what you're doing. So step 1, think about the things that you deeply want. Step 2, write them down on a list. Review this list at least 3 times a day. Think about it as often as possible. Step 3, when these things come to you, give silent thanks and talk to no one about what you're doing. It is an exercise in clarifying desires. It is an exercise in building your morale in the creative capacities and the causative abilities of your mind. It is an exercise in the power of not dissipating your wishes or desires by talking about them to the wrong people. And it is an exercise that has one and only one source of proof, which is whether it works. in my experience, it works, and I encourage everybody to try it.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, I wasn't going to go there, but it just popped back into my consciousness. What are the tools we can learn, and what can you teach us? This is going to be a challenging one for you to summarize briefly from Esau and Jacob.
Well, within the life of Esau and Jacob, you have two conflicting beings. You have Jacob, who is thought to be a gentler, more refined being. You have Esau, who is thought to be a more rough, more coarse being. And nature seems to set these two brothers against one another. Mm-hmm. And seen from a certain perspective, Jacob commits an act of a deception against Esau. He says to Esau, give me your birthright, your right to inheritance. And Esau is hungry, and he effectively gives him his birthright for a bowl of stew. And then Jacob takes this as approbation to go and trick their father, Isaac, whose eyesight is failing him, into thinking that he is Esau and giving him the family blessing, the family inheritance. And Neville makes the point that, look, if you were to take that story as literally true, it would be a very cruel story. But the fact is, we can understand these men as one being. And they both need and are interdependent upon one another. And this one being is capable of committing an act of redemption ultimately by claiming a larger life, because the coarser of the two twins, Esau, sells his birthright for a bowl of pottage, and he gives away his power, his ability, his selfhood over nothing, over a kind of a trinket. And it's Jacob, the other half, the more positive self, who uses the wiles of his mind to claim his full self, his great self, his complete self. And we all have these beings within us. We all are two divided beings, and we have to find ways sometimes to negotiate ourselves, to almost strike bargains with these different sides of our nature so that we don't wind up selling out that which is essential in our lives. We are divided beings as we go through life, and we have to find ways to strike bargains with and build bridges between these divisions.
Thank you. You know, there's a key word here that I really like that you brought up, is claim, to claim something. And this actually makes me think even of Paul Selig in the Guides and claiming who you truly are. And Neville said, to say I am going to be rich will not make it happen. You must believe riches in by claiming within yourself, I am rich.
Yes. And this can be very challenging because, as with the divided space of Jacob and Esau, we have all grown up in different circumstances where sometimes that feeling does not come to us naturally. I have known people who have a feeling that money always comes to them. Money has always just flowed to them. And I've known people for whom money is always a source of anxiety. And that's probably the more typical human situation. And it becomes a very private act of negotiation to figure out what will work within you to come into a feeling of comfort with money, a money consciousness, as people in New Thought will sometimes refer to it. And that requires a lot of individual personal creativity. What works for a New Thought writer you may love does not necessarily work for you. Again, this gets us into the question of there being different personality types, all of which are legitimate expressions, but they're not all going to be the same. So I encourage people listening, if you relate to what we're talking about, feel very radically at liberty to come up with your own methods. You know, I love Neville. I've dedicated so much of myself to this man's teachings. I love this man, but not all of his methods fit the needs and circumstances and psyche of every individual. He was by nature a thespian. Another person listening might not be, but that other person, that doesn't mean that that other person is without resources. He or she just needs to figure out what will get you into that frame of mental creativity. It's personal.
Thank you, thank you. And one of my favorites, and in fact, I think I'm going to sleep on this, Mitch, is sleep. And I'm wondering what Neville means. Sleep is the door to heaven.
Yes. Neville believed that when we are in a state of drowsiness, that's the state of ultimate creativity. That's the state of mental pregnancy. And this was also a point of view espoused by Émile Coué. And people would make fun of Émile Coué for his day-by-day mantra, but what they misunderstood was that Coué's genius was not in the words, but in the application of the words. And Coué would say his day-by-day mantra should be gently whispered to yourself 20 times just before drifting to sleep at night, 20 times just as you're coming to in the morning. This is an extraordinarily important insight that was later validated by sleep researchers who talk about this period of time as hypnagogia, is the term that's generally used in sleep research. It's a very subtle, supple, suggestible time where your mind can be reconditioned, can be influenced. You're experiencing a kind of waking hypnosis. That was Coué's point of view. Neville took it in more metaphysical directions, which I share and believe in, that not only are you in a state of a kind of waking self-hypnosis, but there's a state of pregnancy there as well. For example, and I write about this in the Miracle Club, I write about this in One Simple Idea, psychical researchers, academic ESP researchers have found that hypnagogia, this drowsy state, this in-between state where you're neither fully asleep nor fully awake, is prime time for ESP-related activity. And I go into the details in my books. I won't go into them here, but there's something going on metaphysically and psychologically during those moments just before we drift to sleep that's very powerful. I virtually never go to sleep at night or come to in the morning without praying or reciting a mantra or an affirmation. That is a practice that's part of my 24-hour cycle twice each day.
I love it. We have our book coming out through the same publisher on automatic writing at the end of next month. And it's really a practice of putting people in the hypnagogic state. So if you want to do any sort of manifesting, as above, so below, that's where the time where you can kind of reach across the veil, play with the waters, and then, wow, it appears before me.
And I was very privileged to read that book in manuscript form, and I love it. And I was very, very delighted to be able to supply an endorsement for it. It's very exciting. It meets people right where they live. And it has an epic theme, but it's told in a concise way. And I really appreciate that about the book.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Let's go into a few more laws and tools, and we'll wrap this up. This has been fascinating, Mitch. First off, the law of, I believe it's the law of reversibility, the law of reversibility.
Neville believed that this was possibly his most important teaching. He taught that if you want to reverse or turn around anything that's happened in your day, as you're going to sleep at night, review the details of your day as you would have wished them to occur, and you will set in motion the process of reversibility. He sometimes referred to it as the pruning shears of revision, and believed that we could literally go back and by the act of mental impregnation during this drowsy period, this hypnagogic period, rerun the events of our day as we would have liked them to occur, and that will begin to place in motion this process of selection, of perspective, and of change.
Thank you. And I love that he talks about, you say that if a physical state can produce an emotion, you break your foot, you're not so happy. Physical state produced an emotion. An emotion can also produce a physical state. And by that definition, we really are, mind as God, mind as creator, a lot more powerful when we understand this law of reversibility than we realize.
Yes. And of course, what you bring up also raises questions of our ultimate experience, our ultimate sense of reality. If I kick a rock, I will hurt my foot. I will have the experience of mass. In Neville's system, that is not ultimate reality. Ultimate reality is mind. Ultimate reality is imagination. And yet, we do live in a world, and we do live in a state the vast majority of times where we experience mass. We experience physical decline. We experience all kinds of things that are related to the temporal, physical quality of matter as we know it. And that too has to be negotiated with. I think you could probably find suggestions of that also within the Jacob and Esau story. Jacob, being the more refined brother, is able to make an ultimate claim on the birthright of what it means to be human. But Esau, being the more coarse brother, and again, if we're talking about the same being, it's all of us, he's hungry. He needs that bowl of pottage at that moment. He's been out hunting and hasn't been able to catch anything, and his pangs of hunger are creating a pull on him that leads to him doing something that may not ultimately be for the best purpose. We are these brothers, and we have to deal with, I used to say we live under many laws and forces. I've changed that.
Yeah.
We experience many laws and forces. The law of mind may be ultimate, as I believe it is, but we have to deal with the experience of different laws and forces within the framework that we occupy.
So I'm going to take that one step further, which is just going to be kind of a little bit of a mind bender. We create many laws and forces.
Yes. Our belief in these things is absolutely self-reinforcing. But again, many things are self-reinforcing that are not ultimately real, including time itself. We know, and dig this.
Yeah.
We know as a human species that linear time is not real, that there are exceptions to linearity. Einstein's theory of relativity holds that if an object is traveling at or near light speed, time effectively slows down for that object. Mm-hmm. We've known this for decades. We as a human species know that linear time is perhaps a necessary illusion by which to organize our lives, but we experience it. There are times where the mystic, there are times where the yogi, there are times where the sensitive person who's having an extraordinary state or experience moves beyond linear time, goes outside of it. So we have personal experience of this too, sometimes. And yet, we feel linearity as something very real. So it's just part of the framework that we live in. It's part of the human situation.
I call it the setup, the cosmic setup here to help teach and learn and guide us. I got to view this as a school. And if we fully got that everything was happening at once and there's this multiverse, multitude of universes or a multiverse, and that we're drawing forward whichever, it becomes a candy store, but it could become overwhelming where we don't do anything. We go, okay, it's not real. I'll just sit on the couch. Since there is an amount of chop wood, carry water that we want to do in this world, what's your favorite Neville tool?
Wow. I've never been asked that before. All these years of studying Neville, nobody's ever asked me what my favorite Neville tool is. I would say, Michael, that my favorite Neville tool is the tool that rescued Neville when he was a 17-year-old drama student and was told that he would never make a living using his voice. Yeah. And that was that within this very young person, there upswelled a sense of nobility, of selfhood, of dignity. And that outpictured into one of the most extraordinary metaphysical careers of the 20th century. More people, and this is not just due to digital technology, but it certainly helps. More people are reading and experiencing Neville's work today than they ever did during his lifetime. And Neville, I think, is probably on track to become the most widely embraced, most widely talked about, and figure possessed of the greatest posterity within New Thought tradition. That's my impression.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that was set into motion that day when he decided, instead of being crushed by this cruel drama teacher at age 17, that was going to become the very springboard of his life, and that not only would he make a living using his voice, but he would become arguably one of the greatest spiritual orators of the 20th century. In fact, I could really defend that. I think he was one of the truly great orators of the 20th century. So it's having this sense of nobility, selfhood, dignity, self-purpose. That is what attracted me to Neville, and that's probably the aspect of his life and work that I most internalize.
Woohoo! Tell me, Mitch, how much I'm taking Neville and what he was told to my rooster Ruru. And my rooster Ruru, who is now taking a nap in the Tesla as we're having a talk right now, because he is such a bugler, you could say that noise can be a very piercing sound when he is such a clarion bugling out to the world, or you can link a sense of family, home, love to that. And I'm wondering what Neville linked, because he had to hear that teacher's voice in his head over and over and over again, what and how he linked a different meaning or purpose to that.
Well, he did write of that period. She didn't know, the teacher didn't know the kind of man she was dealing with. And I think he reveled in the challenge. I think he experienced that opposition as a challenge. And that can be a very, very powerful thing. Again, it all depends upon the individual and his or her own psyche. But if you experience opposition as a challenge rather than as mortifying, I tell you, that can be very powerful. That can be very powerful. I found myself within groups of people, for example, and I've wondered, am I being accepted? Am I being understood? Does anybody want to hear from me? And I've gotten very, very quiet. And I've said to myself, I'm not sure, but I know that I'm just here as an entry point, as a growth point, as a point of gestation. I'm going to be growing and growing, and my voice and my persona is going to be more and more and more heard among this group of people with whom I want to be associated. So rather than feeling cowed by it, I feel a sense of quiet and a sense of expectancy and a sense that I'm going to sort of learn the byways that I need to function within this community. So that's one of the ways I experience what might be a circumstance that could create shyness or insecurity as a springboard to what I'm going to grow into.
Woohoo! Just a few last questions for you, Mitch, then maybe time for a brief meditation. You mentioned the word challenge. So what is the challenge you're giving to yourself, or what are you doing to call in, I'm going to say your best new year, because as mind is God, as mind is creator, we can create something even greater than we can imagine.
My challenge is this, and I issue this challenge to myself, and I also issue it to everybody listening. I struggle against traits in myself sometimes. And it's possible that there are certain traits that are not necessarily counterproductive or destructive or unhelpful. We just define them as such. For example, Michael, I've never spent a day in my life being depressed. That's just never been my problem.
Yeah.
But I have often said, and this is the pivot point that I'm driving at. I've often said I suffer from anxiety. I experience anxiety. But look how I just explained it, as I've explained it all my life. I suffer from anxiety. Well, is that necessarily a bad thing? What I call anxiety, which is a word that we feel has a negative connotation, something that has to be gotten rid of. Maybe I'll have a different word next time you and I talk. Maybe it's vigilance. Maybe it's positive. Maybe it's good. I get a lot done. People marvel at my work output and they say, how do you do this? And well, it's passion and it's dedication to the material and it's a feeling of naturalness. It also might be a state of very acute preparation. And maybe I've just mislabeled that as anxiety, which again, we think of as something you have to get rid of, something bad, something you have to shunt out the back door. Maybe that's a state of vigilance disguised. So I want to ask people to think about whether these traits that we're induced by ourselves, by our therapists, by our ministers to struggle against maybe don't require struggling against. Maybe they require reframing. And I mean that very seriously.
I was just reviewing our book yesterday. We're in final edits. I will go from this immediately. In fact, I'm debating, do I get a little workout in before I go back into the book? Because the publisher needs it like yesterday. And, and they need it, which is why we actually pushed off this interview. I say in the book, fear and anxiety are excitement without deliberate action. Meaning they are urging you forward, but there's a sense of urgency in a deliberate direction. The bomb is diffused when you take specific action. So if you're worried, I'll let you go, but it's that word specificity that seems important to me.
If you can attach a productive action to a certain mood, then I would say that mood becomes redefined, maybe retroactively redefined as positive. I have had experiences where I'm very vigilant sometimes about saving my work, about double checking my work, about not pressing send on an email. And I'm always told by people, relax, chill out, don't take it all so seriously. But I've caught a lot of mistakes. I've saved a lot of problems. I often tell people, you think OCD is a problem? I want my airline pilot to have OCD. I want a brain surgeon to have OCD, and I'm really, not fully joking. I knew a neurosurgeon once from the University of Arizona Medical Center who confided to me that he had OCD. And I remember saying to him, I'm comforted by a brain surgeon having OCD. Obviously ritualistic behavior can become problematic, but if you're using OCD as a stand-in to describe hypervigilance has its place.
I like checking the door multiple times. I like checking the stove multiple times. I am completely okay with that.
It could save your life someday. I mean, there are things that people do that they would be warned off from doing that would be considered excessive. And these things, all it takes is just a wrinkle of crisis, and what that person has done becomes wonderfully beneficent. So I just want us to not take for granted that there's behaviors that we always need to be struggling with. It may be that a productive act, as you're saying, must emerge from the behaviors. We don't want these behaviors to instill passivity in us. Mm-hmm. But if they're not instilling passivity, and if we are able to follow through with some productive act that's not ruinous in some way, like some deeply ritualistic, repetitive act that takes us out of the social circle that we ought to be in or something like that, if that's not occurring, then it could be that the thing that we have conditioned ourselves to struggle against is actually a positive.
Where can people go, Mitch, to find out more and to find this beautiful book, which I don't even believe is out as we're speaking?
Oh, the book is actually out. The Ideal Realized is out. Obviously, you can find it on Amazon or wherever you purchase books. It's in digital. It's in physical form. It's not yet in audio form. That's not out yet. I have yet to record the audio, and I'm looking forward to that. People can find me at my website, mitchhorowitz.com, or on social media, on Twitter at Mitch Horowitz or Instagram at Mitch Horowitz23. And social media tends to be the most up-to-date way of connecting with me.
Very cool. And I was wandering around this morning. I'm here in California, which is a whole beautiful, miraculous story that I never expected. It's the or something better. And I was wandering around this morning going, wait a second. There are no studios open in California right now for recording our audiobook. They're not considered essential services. They've all been locked down.
Yeah. I have been able to work with a studio here in the Northeast in New Jersey, but they've opened as a sort of special dispensation. And we're going to look back on this year, and in fact, maybe that will inform our closing exercise. We're going to look back on this year and the things that people have gone through are hard to conceive of.
Oh. And yet, and I say this without any levity, without any callousness, I truly believe globally, meaning for the whole of the individual, I guess holistic might be a better term. This time, as you bring it full circle, friction is here to serve us, is truly going to help us.
Well, it certainly awakened me to a variety of things that I needed to sort of shake out of in my life. It has allowed me to shake off certain habits. It has compelled me to look at aspects of my work as a writer and speaker in a different light. And I think certainly it has disrupted things that were very easy and familiar to me and compelled me to do things in a new way that I might not have done were it not for necessity.
You and me both. Any last words of wisdom before we dive into any exercise of your calling?
My only last words of wisdom are I really, truly ask people to think very, very flexibly. The language that we use is such a force for conditioning us. Just as I was saying earlier, I suffer from anxiety. Look how I framed that, and I framed it that way all my life.
You put yourself in that box.
And I walk into a room, and if I say those words, lots of people in the room would nod their heads and say, "Yeah, me too," and agree with me. And so along with that comes this kind of conditioning or inculcation that I have to then push back against something called anxiety. Whereas, in fact, it could be one of the absolute greatest things in my life or in the life of somebody listening when expressed as vigilance. I don't know that these traits are dysfunctional traits or negative traits or bad traits any more than I would say that different demonstrations of personality are necessarily negative or bad just because they don't match one ideal or another. I don't want people to feel narrowly hemmed in. I want them to think very flexibly about who they are in their psyches, who they are in their personalities, and the legitimacy of that.
Thank you, because you just gave permission to people. If we want to talk about becoming a thespian and being able to dream that greatest dream, whatever that means to us, and dream it into reality, then if we're picking on ourselves and saying, I've got this problem, I've got that problem, we don't really allow ourselves to. And when you say, well, maybe it's not a problem, maybe it's not a
problem at all. Yeah.
Then you have freed people to hop to the other side.
Yes. That's my wish.
Woohoo! That's my wish. So, meditation, exercise, anything you feel called for, Mitch?
Sure. I'm going to offer an exercise rather than a meditation. And the exercise is this. I'd like people to give themselves permission over the next few days from this discussion to pretend as though they were a very small child, that they are in situations among people circulating in ways that make them filled with joy, make them feel filled with possibility, with ease. We all know that feeling that we have when we are in the right company, when we are among the right people, when we are in the right setting, this wonderful naturalness and ease and good humor that settles over you as an individual. Use your imagination without telling anybody what you're doing. It's your own intimate private exercise, just to imagine yourself performing the act that you would like to perform in the place that you'd like to perform it, among the people that you'd like to be among, whatever that may be. And please, don't be ashamed of any of it. Don't feel that you need to seek anybody's approbation. It's your private, intimate exercise. I don't think we do quite enough of this, and I don't think we realize how much of it we may do that's affecting our lives in ways that are obfuscated or hidden from us. I have found an extraordinary congruency between what I'm doing today at age 55 and the imaginings that I entertained at age 5. So it's taken a long time in a certain sense, and yet those hidden tendrils of connection are there. And I don't think we permit ourselves as adults to freely engage in this kind of childlike imagination, and to do so purposefully, understanding the metaphysical implications as we do, at least those of us who are down with what was discussed today. So imagine, pretend, allow a childlike abandon into that part of your life, and don't tell anybody about it. Keep it private, and let that be your experiment, and let that be something you allow yourself to do over these next few days.
Woohoo! Wouldn't that be fun?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be a fun way to go about the world?
Yeah. Yeah. I was very conscious of doing that all the time when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, and I think it's proven to be a very important part of my life. It's probably why the experiences that validate for me Neville's teachings, for me personally, are experiences over the arc of my lifetime rather than immediate things. Although they could be immediate just as well. But for me personally, I see them in the long term.
Thank you. I can't believe I'm going to throw in one little tiny last question. Please forgive me here, Mitch, but you triggered a thought with the arc. If we look at, because this brilliant book, The Ideal Realized, is following the arc of Neville's life. How did his teachings change, or where did he end up in 1972 as far as his mindset or what he was thinking at that time?
Well, there were, I would say, a couple of primary changes that occurred in not so much his way of thought, because his way of thought was consistent, but I would say in his emphasis. As he got older, he spent less time on the acquisitive side of his philosophy and more time on the transcendental side of it. And he said the purpose of using your mind as a magnet is to reveal to you your powers of mental creativity. But the greater meaning behind that is to ultimately reveal yourself to you as you truly are, infinite, transcendent. And that became the core part of his teaching. He would talk about the law and the promise, how every individual was going to be reborn from his or her own skull, for which there's actually a lot of precedent in religious parable and story, and come to realize themselves as the creator clothed in flesh. And there was a speaking agent who said to him, listen, you're losing your audience. You got to go back to your early teachings about money getting and leave some of this more heavy metaphysical stuff behind, or you're going to have no audience at all. And Neville said the following words, and I have these there's an artist, Tim Boda, who created for me personally a drawing of Neville, which I will share on social media when this show posts, with the words that Neville responded to the speaking agent. He said, then I'll tell it to the bare walls. So when I speak about the nobility that Neville comported himself with, I really mean it.
Thank you, Mitch. This has been phenomenal. You have outdone yourself with this work. This is the most brilliant way to both end the year and, or no matter when you're listening to this, start anew. We have our new logo as a rising phoenix because I believe we are all.
Oh, great. Wow.
So it took us a long time to hone this. I'll have to show you this when we get off air, and we're very excited about it. It's where we're all at right now. It's a complete time of reinvention, of reassembly. And Neville would say, use your imagination and get busy with it.
Get busy with it. Believe in your own nobility and be flexible. Don't allow yourself to get conditioned through language. Look anew at everything.
Awesome. So for everyone out there, this is Michael Sandler, and Putting you on
Shine bright.
I put you on the spot. Michael Sandler and Mitch Horowitz saying, be well, have fun, get the ideal realized, and realize your mind is God. And beyond all else,
shine bright.
Woohoo! Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this latest interview as much as I did. For more on how you can up-level your life, click on the links below for our mini masterclasses, for our boot camps, and for a very limited availability one-on-one coaching with me. Be sure to give this a huge thumbs up if you like this. Leave your comments below, and you can check out more amazing videos here and here. Love you guys so much. Shine bright. Woohoo!